Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. And as we all hunker down at home and spend more time watching Netflix and other streaming services, I thought it'd be a good idea to have a look at what impact the coronavirus is having on creative industries. And I'm delighted that on this episode, I'm joined by Mark Heywood. Not only is he a former colleague of mine, but he's a great friend, and he's got some fascinating insights, having previously worked in financial services and now working alongside creatives, helping them to understand the business side of what they're doing, but also working alongside corporates and helping them to better tell their stories. And in our discussion, we talk about what is happening from the perspective of the creative industries, how is the coronavirus challenging them, both in terms of their business models, but also in terms of the sorts of plots and storylines that they're going to be looking to put in front of us. It's a really interesting conversation, and Mark is a lot of fun, so I hope you enjoy listening to this as much as we did recording it. Mark Heywood, welcome to the Human Risk podcast. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Christian. Long-time listener, first-time caller, but a pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Lovely to have you here. Look, and I want to talk to you about what's going on in relation to the entertainment industry. I mean, how does what we're seeing impact the entertainment industry at the moment?
Well, I'm not sure we have an entertainment industry at the moment, but the industry as we know it is changing on an hourly basis. I think that shoots all over the world, whether it be film or television, and particularly theatrical productions, are being shut down, right? Nobody's working, nobody's doing anything. Actually, no, that's not true. People are doing stuff. They're not just recording. They're not performing in front of live audiences. What you're seeing at the moment is a huge outpouring in online content being made available for free for those people that have content to distribute. What you're seeing is the likes of streamers reducing the quality of their streaming services in terms of the bandwidth that they've got available. They're just sort of dialing down from, high definition just to ever so slightly less than that, just because so many people are at home and wanting to watch stuff. I think the real problem is going to be what we don't know, what's coming down the line. Where are we going to be in 6 months, 12 months? What is the future of the industry going to look like? But right now, people are creating lots of content. They are consuming a huge amount of content. But I really do think that in 12 months' time, the industry may look very, very different, and kind of really happy to dive in and talk about that, because I think it's a really important thing. Because after a while, if we're here at home, as we are right now for 12 weeks, we're going to have burned through Netflix in a very, very short space of time, right?
Yeah. I mean, the industry itself, it's not necessarily obvious if you're a consumer, but, you and I have had conversations. It's a massively risky business. So you kind of put stuff out there in the hope that it works. And so there are fascinating dynamics. We shouldn't be surprised that we get loads of sequels. So they double down on winning content. And of course, if you get it massively wrong, it can cost you a ton of cash. So how do we look at that aspect of it? Because clearly it's risky enough as it is, let alone in a new dynamic that we don't really understand.
And sequels is a great point, because to be honest, Christian, I think we're there already. And I think we've been there for some time. Independent filmmaking is, and indeed studio-based Hollywood filmmaking, is incredibly risk-averse. It's some of the riskiest stuff you could ever wish to do in your life. But what you will find is the major studios will be doubling down on sequels, as they have been for quite a long time. Cinema is an interesting concept, in itself. And, it'd be interesting to talk about whether cinema as a physical location that you go to sit in the dark with a room full of strangers, all of whom are coughing all over each other, will exist in the future. I don't know. However, I think from a film perspective, we've been there for some time because it is so risk averse. Nobody really wants to take a chance on it. So anything that goes immediately into the streaming category, I think will do really well, because people will always want content. And I think there's a groundswell of opinion at the moment that the value of art is whether it finds an audience, not how that audience consumes it, not how much they pay for it, not where they actually get it from, but whether it finds an audience. And at the moment, we cannot leave our homes, or we're being advised to stay where we are. So what we're actually doing is using our devices to download things. Cinema as an art form is incredibly expensive, and is, if it's the old adage of, if you want to make a small fortune in the film industry, then you start with a large fortune, and work your way back, right? Because just a couple of, and your listeners may not know this, but let's just keep the maths really, really simple. Let's say, for example, you spend $10 million making a movie, right? And that is from paying everybody to the point at which you have a product that can be released in theaters for people to go and watch. And let's assume that $10 million movie takes $20 million at the box office. If that happens, you will lose money on your product. And here's why. Because the cinemas, the theaters, they will take anywhere between 50% and 70% of your box office. In each jurisdiction, you will buy the right to distribute your film by selling your product through distributors and sales agents. So they will, for example, say, we will release your film in cinemas in France or in Germany or in Benelux or whoever it is, and you do several deals that will get you that release. Everybody involved in that process will have some claim on your box office, so that what you are left with after having made the film and then marketed it is very, very little, which is why so few films actually make money on what in our industry we call theatrical release, which is in a cinema. Whereas if you are a major Hollywood studio and you know that people are going to spend $20, $25, £15, £20 on a cinema ticket, what are you going to give them? They want something for their money, and what they want is huge action. They want suspension of disbelief. They want effects. They want science. They want science fiction. They want Marvel. They want DC Comics. They want huge things. And cinema has, ever since it was been invented, been chasing the curve of new entrants like television, like video, like, VHS, Betamax, streaming, DVDs, Blu-ray, everything. Cinema has always had to keep up. I think we're looking at a situation where even in a year's time, is it feasible and sensible for us to say we're going to voluntarily leave our homes and go and sit in the dark with a bunch of strangers and watch something on a screen? I don't know. I would like to live in a world where that was still possible, but I'm not sure it is. So I think anybody that's got a new idea can probably do very well right now. And, if you're a streamer, if you're the likes of Amazon Prime and Netflix and, other streaming services are, of course, available, you must be looking at this and thinking, A, this is great because we can really service our customer base, but B, we are going to run out of content very, very quickly unless people start making stuff, which at the moment we're not doing because the whole world is shut down, right?
Right. When you talk about that, you kind of think, how did that industry ever kickstart in the first place, right? Because it's like economically mad. I mean, as you say, why would you invest in movies when the high likelihood is you're going to lose money? And so I think this is a really interesting piece that possibly, should have hit them earlier on. If I look at what the internet has done to travel agents and to the music industry, I mean, it's almost astonishing it's taken this long. So this has been coming for some time, and what I'm reading from your comments is that sort of, there's a high likelihood that those dynamics we've seen in other industries are going to hit that one, and who knows exactly how that plays out. And so there'll be more entrants coming in. So fascinating times, right, for the industry and how it responds. Yeah,
completely. And whilst we're on entertainment, there are other art forms. So if you think about literature, for example, physically handing over cash as an example, and I think you and I talked about this the other day, that's an interesting concept in itself. We're physically and voluntarily handing over potentially germ-ridden products to somebody else into the palm of their hand to buy something, whereas more modern approaches to commerce would be that you click a button, you get something delivered. In fact, these days, you don't even need to get it delivered. It just is simply downloaded onto your device. So I think things like ebooks and downloads will do extremely well. Physical products that require you to literally touch the product may change the way that people consume things in the future. If you talk to anybody under the age of, say, 25, they may very well say, I don't own a television. A television may be something that in the future we remember as the thing in the corner of our living room that all the furniture was pointed at. And yet now we watch films, we watch videos online, we watch them on our devices. And again, the value of art is whether it finds an audience, not how its audience, consumes it. So with the advent of cheaper technology, with faster broadband, and with an audience that just thinks completely differently, why would you get out of your armchair and go and sit in a room full of strangers and watch something? You might not. Now, I get the fact that cinema and Hollywood will respond. It will create better, more immersive experiences. I think the likes of secret cinema and organizations like that may do very well, because what they're actually offering is something that goes above and beyond the immediate screening experience. But everybody is now in this for the long haul. Everybody is adapting. I think that the stories that we tell in the future, I think things like futuristic or post-apocalypse dystopia stories will do very well. I think anything period will do well. Anything contemporary that does not reflect a pre or post or during Corona world, it's just going to look a bit odd. I mean, can you really watch a continuing drama and it not reflect the state of the world? And I don't mean, normally when there's a big sporting event like the Olympics or the World Cup, you might watch a continuing drama like, I don't know, Coronation Street or EastEnders or whatever, and they may say, got to get home to watch the game or whatever, right? They might do something like that, but that's fine. But when we're in this potentially for the long haul, what do stories like that do in terms of reflecting this brave new world? Because you can't really ignore it. You have to reflect it. And, also people are going to be sat here thinking, wait a minute, there's a bunch of people in a pub on television. We're not allowed to go to the pub. So why are these characters in the pub? And the way continuing drama works is that it gives people a set of locations that are immediately familiar, like a coffee shop or a pub or a town square or whatever it might be, whatever your story is. And we go, yes, I recognize that particular location because I'm there all the time. Well, guess what? Pubs are shut, restaurants are shut, coffee shops are probably shut as well. Supermarket shelves are emptying on a very regular basis. So where are your characters going? How do you tell ongoing, continuing drama stories in this new modern age? So I think it's a huge risk and also an opportunity. And I think that the landscape will look very different in not very long. Actually, I think it's already changing. The BBC literally this weekend put a call out for online stories, as in stories that can be told with 2 to 4 characters, all shot through web camera, all shot with people in isolation. So it's already changing. It's happened so fast, because normally societal change of this magnitude takes a very, very long time. At the moment, this is happening day by day, and the way that people are commissioning content and producing content is changing hour by hour. It's absolutely fascinating. I don't think anybody's ever seen anything like this before.
And it's interesting you were saying, I mean, I was watching kind of, cop shows and just shaking someone's hand, giving them a hug and those sorts of basic things, let alone when you get into some of the discussions we've had around series like Friends that were very much of their time, and people have started to question the racial diversity of those things. It's a dynamic that happens anyway. But I think it's really interesting when you talk about it in those terms, because you'll just look at things on screen and go, I don't recognize that world. And if it's supposed to be of this time, it's got to be something that we can associate with.
Friends is a really, really interesting example, actually, because it is and has been one of the most popular shows ever since it came out. I know it has a huge following. I know there's a lot of people that don't like it, and that's fine. Audiences can make their decisions and vote with their remote controls. Of course they can. But Friends is a really, really interesting example, and it's still to this day makes a huge amount of money on a global basis, and it finds new audiences and it finds a way. But actually, when you think about it, it's basically 6 people in a coffee shop or in an apartment. Like, if you were to make that today, how would it work? Would it be 6 webcam shots? Would it be 6 people in isolation? Maybe that's it. Maybe it's as simple as that. You take the premise of 6 friends who all happen to have different belief systems and different ways of looking at the world. And you just, instead of having them in a coffee shop, you physically isolate them. The basic premise of the story doesn't change. It's just the delivery mechanism that looks and feels slightly different. So maybe we just need to think about the way we tell stories, not necessarily changing the underlying concept of the story itself.
Right, that's interesting. And you know, speaking of stories, I'm fascinated by your thoughts around how the virus might change what we see, because you know when we look historically, there's a huge thread of movies around good guys and bad guys, or good girls and bad girls, and you villains and how that plays out. What do you see there? Because you know there have been a limited number of movies that have pandemic type scare stories. But very often we have, I don't know, Jaws as an example, where we have the shark is the theoretically the villain, and we can analyze some of the subplots that are going on. How do you see that shifting when we look at those sorts of storylines?
It's a great question. And yeah, Jaws is a really good example because for some reason we are, and I think we know why, we are addicted to disaster movies, or to movies that sort of get us into thinking about ourselves as people and how fragile humanity is and how we could just be obliterated, at the drop of a hat. I think the thing that hasn't changed, however, is it doesn't matter whether it's a pandemic that isn't necessarily named or talked about that causes a zombie apocalypse, or it's a, coronavirus style story. The reason I think that we're addicted to these stories is because we want to imagine what we would do if we were in that position. So if we were facing the zombie apocalypse, how would we react? What would we actually find within ourselves in terms of courage and the ability to fight adversity? How would we battle the demons? So I don't think that anything, will necessarily change in that regard. There are a few sort of tropes in disaster movies, and particularly, pandemic stories that always reoccur. One of them, one of my favorites, is that all of us are fair game in terms of being a victim, right? So there is no real sense that anyone can be protected from it unless, and I want to introduce the concept of Hollywood science here, right? There is a notion of Hollywood science. In literature, there is a notion of things, of something called Chekhov's gun, which is if there is a gun hanging on the wall in a scene, it needs to be fired at some point during the play. Chekhov was very, very clear about that. In disaster movies, there is a concept of Chekhov's volcano, which is if there is a volcano in a disaster movie, it will erupt at some point, right? Otherwise, we're not being faithful to the genre. So in disaster movies, anyone can get this unless, according to the rules of Hollywood science, there is someone who is, for whatever reason, immune to the virus, and therefore science will find a way of working out why this immunity exists, etc., etc. But I think in terms of will it change stories, it might do, because this virus, as we know it, is, we can't see it. We can only see, the implications of it. But then again, Jaws is a brilliant example, because the reason that Jaws is so scary is that as long as you do not see the shark, it's really, really scary. Once you confront the monster and you can see it, I think things like Jaws lose their scariness. They lose their fear factor. It's all about the fear of the unknown. It's what you can't see. It's the monster that lurks in the shadows or is behind the locked door or whatever it is, right? If you can't see it, it is immediately scary, and scarier than it would be if you could confront it and say, well, you know what? I can now see the virus. I know how to fix this, et cetera, et cetera. So it really plays into the classic disaster movie or disaster story tropes, in the sense that the thing that you cannot see is considerably scarier than that you can see, because at least if you can see it, you know what you're dealing with. When you can't see it, it plays on your deepest, darkest fears. And I think that's why films or stories or books or plays of this nature are really, really great, because it's the imagination that runs riot. And when you cannot see something, it could be really, really scary. And what's scary to you, Christian, is not necessarily what's scary to me. But as long as we haven't defined it visually, we both go to potentially different places and scare the crap out of ourselves, right?
Right. And there's something interesting, on a sort of human risk theme in all of these movies, is that you've got somebody making bad decisions. So if I take Jurassic Park, it's who thought it was a good idea to open up the park. You've got Jaws, where you've got the mayor who makes consistently piss poor decisions, and yet seems in the later movies to still be in post, and therefore the electorate has kind of forgiven him for that. But there's all these examples of sort of idiots, and then you've got the kind of, if I use Jurassic Park as an example, you've got the Jeff Goldblum scientist type who can see what everybody else can't and is calling this stuff out. So there's these character types that we see time and time again, but it's always a case of human beings are making things worse than they need to be by piss poor decision making.
Yes, and just on the mayor so the mayor of Amity in Jaws, let's not forget the fact that he does actually get re-elected, so he does come back, for the sequel. As terrible as his decision making is, he is actually a pretty constant character in that franchise, and there's something in that. But look, audiences demand deeply flawed characters making decisions that we, the audience, fundamentally disagree with. That is the kind of one of the central tenets of drama, of storytelling, is that we need to disagree with the decisions that people make. And at the moment, and I guess from a human risk perspective, we should talk about this, there are some really bad decisions being made in the world right now,
right.
Not just among politicians, but around people and the choices they are taking. So maybe in a way we are sort of playing up to the stereotypes of characters in stories and acting like that ourselves. There are some terrible decisions being made right now, right?
Yeah. And it's funny because you sort of look at it and go, in times when we weren't going through this, you'd watch those movies and go, what an idiot, right? Yeah. Who would be so dumb?
Completely.
And then you find reality is outclassing the movies. and I suspect if you had pitched the current scenario with all the things that we see going on, it would have been sat in the, well, that's a bit ridiculous, nobody would ever do that box.
Yes, it would. And interestingly, as we're recording this, Nicola Sturgeon has had to put another shout out online to say, when I said close pubs, I meant close pubs. Please stop opening pubs so that people, literally that is what we are dealing with at the moment. It is incredibly irresponsible behavior. It is people not doing what they are told. And if this were in a film, you'd be looking at it going, no, nobody would. Well, you know what? People do. And that's why I think the difference between, film or movie life and real life it's a very, very thin margin, because if we had come up with this scenario whereby pubs, restaurants, cafes, gyms were all closed. I mean, I am talking to you from my spare room, and on the other side of my window is my garden. On the other side of that is a park. It is one of the sunniest days we've had of the year. The park is full of people, either running or in some cases sat on benches and socializing. And so what are we saying? Are we saying that we should be in self-isolation except when it's a sunny day? Is that sort of how it works? Is it the case that because we're outside, it's fresh air and that is supposedly good for us, we feel, safe? But then is that any different to the crazy people in films like Jaws who go swimming at midnight when they're told not to and they ultimately die, right? I think we need these characters both in real life and in film, because there will always be someone that ignores either the science or the law. And we've seen it in every single film. And it's a classic horror film trope. That's why Wes Craven's Scream is so successful. It's that line, never ever say, I'll be right back, right? Because you won't be, right? Because anybody who says, I'll be right back is immediately going to die. And from a human risk perspective, when I look at the park opposite me, I just think, you are being that character in a film about your own life. What are you doing outside? It's fascinating.
Right. And look, we're running out of time, so I want to close out by asking you for your recommendations for people who want to kind of get into this stuff. What should people be watching to kind of really understand this dynamic?
Yeah, there's so many, and you could absolutely Google to your heart's content, things to watch during a pandemic. There are a couple of things, 3 things actually that I wanted to recommend. One has nothing to do, with pandemic, but it has a lot to do with the state of the world, and also the fact that you may never get this time again So if you're going to invest a huge amount of your life in watching something, I would completely recommend on Netflix is Ken Burns' documentary about the Vietnam War. It is a huge investment in time. It is about 17 hours, but it will fundamentally change your perspective of what that conflict is all about. And it does say a huge amount about humanity and about the state of the world and about the way that politics is played back to us and the things that we potentially grew up with believing not necessarily being true, which I do think plays to the pandemic state of the world, which is don't believe everything that you're told, particularly when it comes to fake news. So there's Ken Burns' Netflix documentary on Netflix. There's anything either in written form or in the movie franchise that Suzanne Collins created in terms of the Hunger Games, I think is really interesting because that is, clearly set in the future. It ticks many, many dystopian fiction boxes, particularly that of which the notion that children are the future and that communities have had to hunker down and behave ever so slightly differently. So the Hunger Games, I think, should be compelling reading or viewing for everyone. But in terms of reading, this book, it was written in the 40s by Richard Matheson. It's a book called I Am Legend. It was written in 1954. It has been remade as a film many, many times. The last time I think was in 2007 and 2008, loosely based on it, starring Will Smith. I wouldn't recommend watching that, but I would recommend reading the book. It follows the story of the only survivor of a global pandemic, which has turned everybody else into zombies. And if it's appropriate, I just wanted to read a passage from the early part of the book in which this character, who is suffering from severe bouts of depression and is alone contemplating his own mortality and indeed the end of the world, and he just reflects on how easy it would be to end his suffering. So this is the character that Will Smith loosely played, but this is him reflecting on how easy it would be to end everything. Why not go out? It was a sure way to be free of them. Be one of them. He chuckled at the simplicity of it and then shoved himself up and walked crookedly to the bar. Why not? His mind plodded on. Why go through all this complexity when a flung open door and a few steps would end it all? Again, as I say, I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, written in 1954, a great book, remade many, many times. The inspiration for films like Night of the Living Dead and a huge amount of zombie apocalypse films. So if you want to go back to some serious source material, you could do a lot worse than starting with that.
Wow, thank you. And look, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I know that you do quite a lot of interesting things in terms of helping, script writers think about some of these dynamics. And so we'll put in the show notes links to how people can get hold of you and have a look at some of your stuff, because it's absolutely fascinating. And I think not just for people in that industry, but I think generally for us to understand the stories that are going on around us and the way that we look at the world is fascinating. So thank you so much for your time. If this thing continues, maybe we'll get you back on another episode to kind of catch up and get some more recommendations and thoughts. Thank you.
You
so
mean
much.
For a sequel of the podcast? That sounds great. Let's do that.
Exactly.
Thanks for having me on, Christian.
So that's it for another edition of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Mark for coming onto the show and to you for listening. If you're not already subscribed to the podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. Now, all of the things that Mark referenced in his recommendations are in the show notes, as are the details of how to get hold of him if you're interested in talking to him. I'll see you very soon for another episode of this podcast, but in the meantime, do remember, wash your hands and stay safe. Thanks for listening.